This is Dr. Cruz. Our topic this week is folk, popular, and material culture. Folk culture and popular culture differ in their patterns of origins, distribution, and diffusion. And their distribution and diffusion is what I'd like you to think about this week. Folk culture is practiced by small, homogeneous groups living in isolated rural areas, sometimes. Popular culture is found in large, heterogeneous societies that share certain customs despite differences in other personal characteristics. So think about what you might consider to be popular culture, like Beyonce or soccer or football. This week, I would like for you to think about the elements that make up folk and popular culture and focus on the concept of diffusion as you complete the readings and think about how elements of folk and popular culture become a part of your life. Our question for considerations: where are folk and popular leisure activities located? Where are folk and popular material culture distributed? Who has access to folk and popular culture? And what are some examples in folk and popular culture in your life? So at various times in this video, I'd like you to pause the video and think about these elements in your life. What is culture? Let's start by redefining culture. Culture is defined as a collection of social customs, and customs are repetitive acts of groups. So repetitive acts of groups. Think about the repetitive acts of groups that you see. In Japan, just some of the customs that are part of culture in Japan are the pusher. So look at the middle, the picture on the left. The pusher, or ashiya, these are staff employed by the subway company. They wear uniforms, including white gloves, and their job is to push people into crowded subways during rush hour. We might find this unusual, but this is part of Japanese culture. Other customs in Japan include bowing to greet people and taking off your shoes when entering homes, some offices, and sometimes business establishments. Usually, slippers are provided for visitors. Another custom in Japan is not to draw attention to yourself. Women typically wear muted colors that do not stand out. When I visited Japan, I saw a woman wearing a red leather outfit, and I wondered where she was going and whether it was her habit to wear this type of outfit. A habit is a repetitive act of a particular individual. So those of you who know me know that I have a habit of wearing black pants and a black top, and then I change the sweater or jacket that goes over it. So those are usually more colorful. Can you think of some other examples of customs and habits? Pause the video and think about it. So the United States is a nation of immigrants, and immigrants' customs change the cultural landscape of the United States and maybe your neighborhood. And there's evidence of these changes and the impact of different groups that have moved to the United States on our cultural landscape. So I want you to begin to think about these. One of the things that a lot of people enjoy in the United States, and we can talk about food culture. So Chinese immigrants apparently created sweet and sour pork and other dishes just to sell to the Americans. They weren't necessarily part of the Chinese culture, but these were changes they made to accommodate their restaurants in the United States. They are not authentic Chinese cuisines, but then is authentic? As we move from the hearth and our ideas and cultures diffuse to other areas, they also get altered. It's called stimulus diffusion. So you think about how authentic foods get changed to accommodate the new region. And maybe it's because the resources to create the authentic foods are no longer available. So they have to be altered. Germans were one of the largest groups of immigrants to the United States. And one food custom that is transferred to the American cultural landscape is bratwurst and sauerkraut. Interestingly, my husband is from Baltimore, and Baltimore was a large area where German immigrants settled, and sauerkraut is a staple in Baltimore. So at Thanksgiving, my husband's family served sauerkraut. So I found this to be an interesting change in the Thanksgiving meal that I was used to, but it's a custom in his family. Can you give examples of how migration of different cultural groups has contributed to the diverse food customs in the United States? So, customs originate from hearths. So, the hearths are the place where a custom started. Sometimes places, the hearths are maybe unknown or maybe multiple. One of the sports that we have is soccer, or as most people in the world call it, football. So the origins of some sports like football are somewhat unknown, while the hearth of modern football can be traced to 19th century England. The origins of the game are less certain. So football like games can be traced to ancient China, ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, and 14th century England. But the modern version of football originated in England in the 19th century. Popular music and other elements of popular culture, such as food and clothing, arise from a combination of advances of industrial technology and increases in leisure time. So people have more time to play games, to watch um, concerts, to be on Facebook. So technology helps culture diffuse to other areas. So if you think about time, if you lived in the 18th century, the 1700s, where most of our travel was by ship or by horse or carriage, it took information a long time to get from one place to another. So culture and changes in culture would take a long time. Diffusion is slower. Now, because of technology, you can put something on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat, and it could reach somebody across the world in 10 seconds. So it's easier for culture to be spread now. Popular culture tends to be transmitted by the way of hierarchical diffusion. So remember what hierarchical diffusion is. That means there's kind of some type of leadership or hierarchy, and it goes from top down. It diffuses rapidly and extensively from hearts or nodes of innovation with the help of modern communication. So, one example of this is popular music from the Americas, or from the US particularly. During the 1940s, when Armed Forces Radio Network broadcast music for the American soldiers over the areas where they were stationed, it also reached the citizens where the American soldiers were stationed and fighting during World War II. And that enabled American popular music to diffuse to those areas where troops were stationed. So that's a great example of hierarchical diffusion. The picture on the right is a picture of a dulcimer. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever seen a dulcimer. So this is a stringed instrument, and it's not part of popular culture. The dulcimer's origins are probably in the United States, are probably the Appalachian Mountains, but could have been relocated and modified from immigrants from Sweden, Norway, Germany, France, or other nations. We're just really not sure. It appeared early in the 19th century, and the use of the dulcimer has slowly diffused beyond the Appalachian region, but I would say it remains in the category of folk culture because it's not something that you see among most people. Soccer or football is an example of a sport that has started as a local custom that is transformed into popular culture. As stated earlier, its origins are questionable. It began as a folk activity in England and diffused to other countries slowly through relocation and hierarchical diffusion. So, if you think about the diffusion, as the British Empire expanded, as the British folks moved to different parts of the world, the sport of football relocated as people migrated, and then as we have the World Cup and the popularity of football, the mission of FIFA, or the World Federation of Football Association, is to spread football around the world. So you have football diffusing from multiple means: relocation diffusion, and other forms. So this map shows the nations that participated in the World Cup, which is the football World Series, um, in 2014. There are participating nations on all continents except Antarctica, of course, because it has no um, year-round residence. So one could argue that football has become globalized. People are playing football on all continents. The participation in the World Cup has been, nations have been included from all parts of the world. So, why have such sports as, say, American football or cricket not diffused as widely as football or soccer? So, I want you to think about the housing culture in the District of Columbia. This is something we see every day. So, one common aspect of popular material culture are our buildings. In Washington, D.C., the cultural landscape is defined by row homes or row houses. Popular types of row houses include the Federal style and Victorian. These are on the top of your screen. And then the Federal style has led to variations, and one variation is the Wardman style, which is on the bottom of your screen. So the Federal style, also called Adams, after John Adams and his relatives, was popular from 1780 and 1840. So if you think about diffusion, the housing style came largely from England, because as the English were the first settlers. And the housing style that was popular was this Federal style. These houses are typically symmetrical. Originally, they were 2 stories tall with 2 to 3 bedrooms. They feature rectangular construction. They have low-pitched or gambrel roofs, and they have a fan light over the paneled front door, which you can see, or a fan shape. And sometimes in the middle of this fan, there is a keystone. Now, these images, I don't think you can see the keystone, but these are elements you can look for in Federal style homes. Now, sometimes Federal style homes also featured the shutters on the sides, but all of the Federal style homes don't have shutters. And Federal style buildings included single family homes, schools, and churches, along with the row homes. So the Victorian style homes that are on the right were built in the 19th century. Victorian homes were built for wealthier families. They were more ornamental. They had elements that extended out, so they were less rectangular and less symmetrical than the Federal style homes. They have bay windows, peaked roofs, and curves. And some of these homes have as many as 5 bedrooms, and you can see that they are 3 or 4 stories high. So as we get into the 19th century, this type of housing stock is added. Now, as we get into the 20th century, we have the developer and builder whose name is Harry Wardman. And he transformed the Federal style home and built a large number of residential buildings, approximately 3,000 in the district. Many of these were row houses in Northwest DC, and you can see a sample of those on the bottom image. They were built, these 3,000 homes and buildings were built between 1900 and 1930. And Henry Wardman also was from England. Some of these homes are modest, so they might have been 2 stories, but others became more luxurious. And one of the features that Harry Wardman added were the front porches. So you see the front porches on the homes, and in some cases, the idea of these front porches was to extend the living space of the home. So this was like an outdoor living room, and you will see in some homes where people enclosed those. They also had a small front yard, whereas the original federal style houses sometimes were built very close to the street, as was more common in the earlier time period. And you'll see in some of the Wardman homes, it looks like there's a third floor. You'll see the third story dormer windows, which actually most of these were attics, and this was not a full floor, but they appeared to be a full floor. So as you travel throughout Northwest DC, you can see these homes all over the place. Wardman also built apartment buildings, hotels, including the Wardman Marriott at Wardman Park and the Wardman Apartments on 17th Street. So you can, as you travel through the city, take a look at the homes and see if you can identify these styles. Now, some other housing and building styles include the Tudor, bungalow, and Beaux Arts. So the era of the Tudor home began in the early 1900s. They feature steeply pitched gable roofs, exposed dark wood that outlines the doors and the windows, and asymmetrical facades. The bungalow, which you'll find in probably Northwest DC, moving into Maryland in areas like Tacoma Park, they have low pitched roofs, and they're usually 1 or 1.5 stories tall. They have a veranda that encircles the house under shades of hanging roofs. And this style was built at the early 20th century. And then one of the styles that's interesting because it's featured in some houses, but largely in buildings, built between the 1920 to 1930s. These houses were based on French architecture. They were more stylish and jazzy. And this, you can think about the era of the 1920s, which were more stylish and jazzy and ornamental. So these homes were built at this time and buildings in the district. And you can see they're more ornate. They contain marble, granite, carved wood, and sometimes intricate ironwork around the ornamental doors and windows. Let's talk about how people get access to folk and popular culture. Now, the interesting thing in the era of mobile phones, Snapchat, Pinterest, that means folk and popular culture could be disseminated equally and quickly. But it still happens that some things diffuse more than others. Our electronic technologies allow images and messages about popular culture to spread instantaneously around the globe. Several decades ago, a large percentage of the world's population did not have access to television because of their lack of income, electricity, or service. Watching TV is now one of the most popular leisure activities in the world. The technology by which television is delivered is changing throughout the world. The internet services has diffused at rapid pace throughout the world, and it diffused much faster than the television did. And it is likely to continue to diffuse even further in the years ahead because you can access the internet on a mobile phone that you can carry with you. And, it is a relatively inexpensive item that a lot of people have access to. People in the United States have dominated the use of social media during the early years, but social networking sites like Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest still enjoy the greatest popularity in the United States, but are diffusing rapidly to other countries. So, what are some of the challenges in accessing electronic media? Well, because media outlets are largely Western, their content may present values and beliefs that are in conflict with some places, particularly those where governments have a greater control over media. So they attempt to restrict the programming available to the population. In some places around the globe, residents have sought out Western programming otherwise not available through the use of satellite dishes. Governments around the world are also trying to limit the internet content in their countries. Social media has started to play an even more significant role in spreading um, the monopoly of government control over diffusion of information. And I'm going to end with this map, which shows government's levels of censorship of internet information. The countries in the orange show the highest level of government censorship or filtering, while the countries in the blue show no evidence of filtering. You can see the highest level of filtering in China and Iran, the next highest levels in selected Middle Eastern and African nations, and selective filtering across Asia and Africa. Countries limit accesses to four types of internet content: political content, social content, security content, and internet tools. Now, the United States shows no evidence of filtering. Do you believe that? I recently talked to a colleague who's writing a novel on probably espionage. And she says, as she is clicking through various websites, particularly maybe those that the FBI is monitoring, the FBI actually contacted her on her computer. So while this data shows little evidence of filtering, I do imagine that filtering is occurring in the United States. So as you move throughout the week, think about examples of how folk culture has evolved into popular culture in some cases, and look for some examples of folk and popular culture in your life. Think about how language helps contribute to the spread of folk and popular culture. And then as we move into next week, we'll start thinking about international language. Do we need an international language? What is the international language? And which languages do most people in the world speak? Continue to do geography as you move throughout space this week and explore your cultural landscape.